We think we've got it all figured out. And you need to shake that confidence. You need to inject some noise in the system. I write as a curious person. I was kind of a newbie to the psychedelic community, so I think that made it much more accessible to other people. I was a very reluctant psychonaut. I had 6 guided journeys, 2 ayahuasca circles, 1 LSD, 1 psilocybin, 1 5-MeO-DMT. The night before every one of these experiences was sleepless. The cautionary voice was my ego, trying to protect itself against an assault. It's a kind of death, and you fight it. If you've been properly prepared, you're going to surrender to it. As a writer, I really like to bring a variety of different lenses to a topic. If you combine science with personal experience, with history, then you begin to get a whole picture. Something's going on. The culture's ready to have this conversation. I do see these medicines as addressing some of the big problems we face as a society. The environmental crisis, which flows from our disconnection from nature, and tribalism, which flows from our disconnection from people unlike ourselves. I do think that psychedelics can teach us important things about death. Am I less frightened of death? Perhaps. Perhaps I am. Well, we have to talk about the definition of spirituality, but I had a very profound experience with plants in my garden on this psilocybin trip. Now, you should understand I've always given plants a lot of credit. I've written about plant intelligence. I wrote a piece for the New Yorker a couple years ago. But man, I felt it for the first time, that these plants in my garden were regarding me in some sense. They don't have eyes or anything, but they were just like, their presence, the sense that they did have, that I wasn't the only subject. You know, normally we think we're the only subject, everything else is an object. No, they were subjects too. They were spirits in that sense everywhere. And it's a very common phenomenon on psychedelics to have this sense that consciousness is more evenly spread over the world and not just locked in here, and that other beings are more alive than you realized. And I definitely had that with these plants. And I felt like I was one character among many in this garden rather than the human overseeing the garden. And it was a deeper connection to nature than I'd ever felt. I don't think there's anything supernatural about that. I would say it's spiritual in this sense. And this will just take a minute to develop, but what happened to me, as I said earlier, I didn't think I'd had a spiritual experience.
Which kind of surprised me.
Yeah, I know, but I didn't feel like I had. I mean, the way I talked about plants sounds kind of spiritual, just what I was saying. But I assumed that spiritual meant supernatural in some sense. Yeah. That you had to leave the laws of nature and science. And it was an experience that refuted them by showing you that there was some divine force you weren't aware of, or God, or whatever it was. And I didn't buy that. And but I came to understand spirituality in a different way over the course of writing this book. And that was that the opposite of spiritual is not material, as I had thought. The opposite of spiritual is egotistical. And that it is ego and the ego defenses that wall us off from the kinds of really powerful connections that constitute a spiritual experience. I'm talking about the experience of love for someone else or for nature. I'm talking about feeling like you're part of nature, you have that deep connection with nature. The ego keeps us, puts these walls up. It patrols the boundary between self and other. It tends to encourage us to objectify the other. And not see that there are other subjects looking back at us all over the world, like your tree. And so when I came to understand that that was the opposite, that I was having spiritual experiences, and they were experiences of deep, powerful connection. And that's what I think spirituality is. Now, for some people, that connection is with some idea of the divinity and higher power. And I can totally even see that in a naturalistic sense. So I don't think I've given up my materialism, but I have acquired a spirituality without giving it up. And that was a big surprise for me, and a big turn. And I've realized since that to the extent I can lower the voice of my ego, I can make available those kind of connections.